Hello? Hello? Okay,
Hi, yeah, this one's fine.
that's better, yeah. All right, so let's get stuck into the interview. First question, Sue, why was it important for you to write An Angel's Demise from the narrative point of view of a saga?
I think that probably was the easiest way because I was trying to tell both sides of a story. And I think you couldn't possibly tell it unless you did it in the form of a saga. And a family saga works because it hinges on two core families, the Williams family and Angel's family. And yeah, so it intertwines quite well when you do it that way.
Um, I also agree with that because I found that the history gave us a lot of the pathology of the characters. And so the story was very, very rich. One of the other things that you did that was very, very detailed in the story was the world building in the novel. So the novel is set in Rhodesia, and as Rhodesia transitions into Zimbabwe. But we touch on many other countries in the novel. So London is a key space. South Africa is a very key space because of its connection to the family line you're tracing in the novel. So in terms of the world building, it becomes very, very rich because you begin to understand the psyche of the different family members. But what I found very interesting is that as you were tracing key events in history, particularly the Rhodesian Bush War, you helped us experience them not from a historical, factual narrative, but from the character's experience. Like we're sitting around a kitchen table and your father is telling you, well, actually, when this happened, this is where I was, this is what happened. How did your process go in terms of gathering all of that material? Was it archives? Were you doing interviews with people who were alive during that time? How did you capture such rich detail?
So I used a lot of sources in order to relive that history. So I read a lot of books written on that period of history. I spoke to people who were alive who also went to the war. I watched a lot of documentaries. There's a lot of archival material that's available that people can actually watch online as well. So and I really enjoyed the visuals because the visuals really help when you want to recreate a scene and put yourself in there. Because I think the beauty with personalizing history is it brings it closer. So if it's a character that is in it in the war, you feel like you're there. You feel deeper empathy as well because you're also going through the same experiences. So that's why I chose to do it that way. Otherwise, you might as well just read the history from an academic book. That's what fiction does. We bring it. We can play around and bring the emotions and bring it much closer to home.
Lovely. Some of the things that you also researched was music during the different times and eras, and music according to different cultural segments and subcultures, and how those different subcultures were clashing or in conversation through music at that time. So what you'll notice as you read the book is that key defining moments in, for instance, Angel's life have music of a particular time to it. And in some parts, the music is so intricately tied to what's happening, you almost feel like something unspoken, which is a bigger story, is being told than the words on the page. Was all of that music part of your own personal history, or did you also do quite a lot of research into that?
Okay, some of the music wasn't. I mean, when the book starts in the 70s and Simpiwe and Douglas are getting married, I mean, obviously I wasn't even born then, but that music speaks to that era and that time. With, Melanie also reflecting on her time being at school studying music. But then as we go through Angel's teenagehood, those songs definitely were my childhood. So that was me also reflecting on memories of my own teenagehood. But they definitely form a soundtrack to the story.
Definitely, and I really enjoyed that. And I think something cool that you can do when you are reading the book for yourself is maybe take a moment and listen to some of those songs as you process some of the events that happened, because it's a big, big story. And it's really interesting because you begin to see how much a human life carries from all of the lives connected to it before, but also the larger context in terms of society, politics, culture, arts, and music. Um, let's get into the characters. So the story revolves around Angel, but you do a lot of work in setting up her background, her roots, and how Angel actually comes to even be Angel. And one of the key characters that slowly grew to be one of my favorite is Paul Williams, who is farmer, father, and mentor to Angel. When you started writing the book, did you think Paul was going to end up where he was going to end up in terms of his relationship with Angel?
No, it didn't. I didn't deliberately do that. The relationship kind of evolved as the story also grew. But the father aspect of it is very intentional, because if you think of how the book starts, and he's the one who actually pulls her out of the womb, there really is a connection there. But without giving too much away, it becomes a very complex relationship between the two. And it also, in a way, deals with the dynamics, interrace dynamics, black and white as well.
Definitely. And even while Paul is a typical white roadie farmer, and we are expecting him to do many certain things, it's almost like Angel draws out this other aspect of his personality through the book. And it's quite an interesting and amazing journey, because Paul does not set out to be a powerful, prominent character in the story. He's almost a little bit like a reluctant hero. And so whilst he was highly offensive most of the times, he then became quite adorable for me by the end of the book. So, and one of the things I found really interesting was Paul shows us that all of us as parents are different parents with different ones of our children, because our children are born at different times in our development. And so I think Paul really, in his character development, shows us that in a very unwitting and unassuming way. So I really enjoyed Paul. Thank you, Sue, for Paul.
And I think we also experience people differently. I mean, you can all agree. Even though your relationship with your parents, amongst your siblings, they also have different relationships, even though you're raised in the same house. And so I also bring that through in the book as well.
Yeah, definitely. So you really do feel like you're part of the family, and you can relate and be like, yeah, I know who that brother is in my family, and I know who that sister is in my family. And this conversation, I've been there when that went down, so I can feel it. Other characters that were interesting to me, particularly, were Mabusi and Kiwa, or Busisiwe and Kamisile, Angela's grandmother and great-grandmother and grandmother. So these two women are sometimes in contrast or conflict, and then other times very strong in unison at critical moments. And what I loved actually in the very beginning of the book, when most of the women are in the house really together for the only time they're in the book, is the statement when you describe Kanyisile coming home from work. So Kanyisile is coming home from work to her mother, who is Mabusi, and her daughter, who is Simpiwe, who is the mother of Angel. And this is how Sue puts it. When Kiwa returned, it felt like the space had become too small for them. 4 generations of women heaving, humming, howling, and hurting under one roof. And I was like, if that's not a frank description of family dynamics with generations of women in particular, and African women in particular, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, those two gogos or grannies, whatever you want to call them, are very powerful in the story. And in a sense, they reflect how women really struggle and strain against patriarchy. It doesn't matter whether it's white patriarchy, black patriarchy, but it's the same struggle throughout, and how they also overcome, because they do overcome it, because then their story just becomes, in a sense, spiritual.
Yeah,
and whereas in some instances they're powerless, they become very powerful. The spiritual elements that come into the story. I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, I'm taking you there.
Okay, so then moving now to the actual mother figures in Angela's life. So Angel has 2 mother figures. So there's the mother who raises her, who's Melanie, Paul's wife. And then there's the mother who birthed her, who is Simpiwe. And both, to me, despite their contrasting volumes in the book, have very powerful impact on Angel's journey and trajectory, particularly in terms of her self-worth as a woman. Was what was the driving motivation behind those two particular characters?
So essentially, I mean, Simpiwe really gives birth to Angel, but because of circumstances, she doesn't really raise her. So you kind of have Angel being adopted by Melanie, and in a sense, she doesn't really have a sense of identity in terms of blackness, you know, and that's where she's also trying to navigate and find her sense, because it's now rooted in Melanie and the Williams family, and that's also part of the journey that informs Angel's story.
Definitely. It's also very, very interesting for me. Melanie and Simpiwe, Mabusi and Kiwa are kind of like all of the women in the untold story of our like struggle for independence as a country, and kind of like a very full and well-rounded story of all of the women. In fact, when I first saw you, I was like, Sue, all of the women are in the book. Like,
yeah.
This is a book for women, and it's about all of the women. And it was very enriching from that perspective, because even the role of the men, which was very true to how men were in that time in terms of the systems of patriarchy in our traditional cultures, but also for white farmers, that white farming community, even that still like shines a spotlight on this untold story of the women. Even through that, there's like a voice that is very feminine, and that's very much the untold story of women that maybe we haven't asked or wondered or inquired enough about, in terms of what happened to the women during that time, and why are the women as they are now because of those things. So I really, really was encouraged by how you did that with those four characters. And then our love interest.
There's always love, because it's such a bloody book in terms of war as well. It's heavy that thing.
So Bradley, our love interest. So I'm going to ask you what I asked you before. Do you like Bradley?
I do. I love all my characters. Even the nasty ones. Because, you know, everyone's complex and everyone's flawed. You know, but even flawed people have good sides to them. And like, you know, I said earlier, we experience people differently.
Well, I have always believed that Sue is a very frank voice in terms of her writing. So, and I really appreciate that, because if you're going to talk about the hard stuff, you might as well be very candid and straightforward. So I've really always appreciated that through all of your works. But with Bradley, that was really frank, because there were moments I was deeply in love with him, and then there was moments all I could say was like, but Bradley.
And you also have to think of the choices that he made. It's always in the context of, you know, there's always context around your decisions. And I think there's some decisions you make, if you were asked to make them again, you would not make them the same way. And I think sometimes it's the circumstances that force you to take decisions that maybe aren't necessarily desirable, but it's not necessarily what you want, but it works then. Yeah. And I think for Bradley,
yeah, Bradley is a real life story. It's a true story. Okay. So then Angel also has her sister Adrian. And that relationship is very much like a supporting, almost character kind of relationship with the protagonist. But it's inverse in the book, because for so much of the book, Angel feels inferior to Adrian. But what I was struck by was that as much as that is colored through the lens of race, as how it was interpreted during that time, it was also very true to a sibling relationship. Yeah.
The domineering biggest sister, larger than life. Yeah. And I mean, Angel's still trying to find herself and find her compass in life. So yeah, that really did work well.
It did work well. And I think Adrian was also one of the children through whom we accessed a different kind of parent or father in Paul. So I'd be interested to hear how you guys relate to Adrian and relate to the trajectory of Adrian and Angel's life, Angel's relationship through the story. And then finally, the lady of the day, Angel herself. So Angel is very interesting. Like all of the characters, she's got a nickname and she's got her name. But her names, there's a little bit more fragmentation in her names, which speaks to that identity journey she's going through. Was that deliberate? Was that a literary device for you?
Yes, that was deliberate. And I think, as you will read in all the books, everybody's names change. When people went to the war, their names changed. And it also becomes a device in the way their characters also change. So I played around a lot with the names, so there's a deeper meaning behind the names as well.
Definitely. And do you think that there's a parallel with how Angel's name is changing and Rhodesia's name and identity is changing?
It's the very same way. I mean, we went from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, and it's that transformation, because you can almost see Zimbabwe as a character as well in the book, in the sense that Rhodesia dies and Zimbabwe is born, and the name change, and the names that also change from Harare, Salisbury, Salisbury to Harare. Yeah, that changed as well.
Another thing with names and then identities and gender is when you describe, there's a short piece in the book where you describe the Lancaster House Agreement deliberations, but you do it using personification, and all of the countries are women. What was your thinking behind that?
That was also deliberate. I mean, I thought, look, it could be just boring to discuss that whole political thing as it was, but I just thought it would be fascinating, especially if you have them as women, because remember, we had Margaret Thatcher at that time, and she was such a strong presence. So I thought, let me personify all the countries and make them female, because it just made the discourse more interesting and lively and animated. And incidentally, that's a chapter, my editor wanted out, and I loved that chapter. I was like, no, this one's staying. Anything else can go, but I'm fighting for this chapter. And I think it worked well, because you can almost see Ethiopia as a woman with her curly hair. Yeah, I loved it. I loved writing that chapter.
I'm very glad you kept it in. You kept that chapter, and I mean, if I was doing a crack lesson in English literature, I would put that chapter as a passage and be like, discuss. Because you have to be really quick with history to understand some of the imagery that Sue uses in how she dresses up the women, to understand where those countries were at that time, where the Lancaster House Agreement was happening. And so I promise you, this is something you don't want to miss. So if you haven't read the book, get the book. Book Fantastics is here, they're in the back, and get that. Talk about that chapter and tag us on Instagram and Twitter, because we want to know how you process that as well. But it was very, very well written, and I'm glad that you fought for it to stay.
Yeah. No, I love that chapter. I think what I also liked about Africa then was the unity, everybody working to see the liberation of each country. And I just love how Nigeria used her power for the good of Zimbabwe or Rhodesia then. So, and we don't see that anymore. I think there's a lot of self-centered and selfishness now in everything that happens. Everybody's self-interest, nationalism, nobody cares about the next person. And I think really that's a shame for the continent.
Definitely. So to turn the conversation to a different track, in the book, houses and land are intimately tied to life and identity. Well, that's how I processed it. Especially with the Williams and the different houses they have or go to during different seasons of their life. Was that on purpose, and particularly with Angel's trajectory through finding a home and a house?
Yes, it was deliberate in the sense that, the land is part of our identity and who we are, and our fight has always been about the land. And if we go throughout history, everybody's always been fighting about land. And so that's why, the story is set on Bell Acres. So it's like the anchor, and that becomes like the core. And each time we move away from there, it's like we're not anchored, we're displaced. And so that's why we gravitate towards back to the farm.
Definitely, but I think also in the way that you dealt with land through the story of the Williams family and Angel in that family is that I think often land in this country is it's a binary discussion. It's very polarized. It's us versus them. It's white versus black. And it's done that way because of political agendas. But in this story, in terms of the story of land, you retold it through people working the land, people with a spiritual tie to the land, and what that meant, and what that means in a family, and almost made a case that all of us have a tie to the land. And like when we start to have that very next level, higher plane relationship where we begin to bring forth from the land and grow with the land, ownership becomes almost, to a certain extent, fluid. Would you agree with that?
No, I totally agree. I mean, our umbilical cords are buried in the land somewhere. So, yeah, definitely there's a relationship there. And I think I also look at the black on black contestation with the land as well. So it's looking at the different aspects of the land story and the land question as well.
And then obviously a theme, it's already highlighted in the synopsis to the book, so I'm not giving anything away. There's going to be violence, okay? All right, all kinds of violence. You particularly, I think, show some of the brutality of that violence in terms of how the women almost silently absorb it in different ways and different kinds of violence, because there's almost, I would say, every kind of violence in the book. Do you think that is something that is critical to keep amplifying in women's stories, especially African women's stories?
Yes, because we're not immune to violence. I mean, it's not even just an African story. I mean, Melanie wasn't immune to the violence she also experienced as well. So all women, and I think that's why it's important as women to rally together, because what the injustice suffered by one woman may be suffered by you the next day. So it's not enough just to look at the way and say, it's not my story, it's hers. We all women here. Well, we've got some men, sorry, in the audience. We're just saying that each of us is vulnerable as women. No one is spared in a patriarchal society.
Definitely. And if you want to know a particular moment, there's something Sue does that's very special as we're climaxing in the book, where two key characters have a conversation just about this. If you haven't read it, go read the book. And she tells it very beautifully, and there's a moment of reckoning. And for me, it's almost a conversation that I wish more women would have, frankly, with each other. So thank you very much for doing that. And that's something that you can all really, really look forward to. Another device that you use is the event of fires. Why are there so many fires in Angel's life?
Because fire is also very symbolic. Whether it's in the Bible or just in real life, I don't know, in spirituality, there's something about fire. And that's why it keeps cropping up in different places, whether it's to, and it's mostly destruction. It comes with, destruction. But there's also the beauty of rising from the ashes after fires. So that's why I use fire a lot.
Definitely. I think fire is something that keeps cropping up, and so after the first fire I was like, oh, that was a bit rough, and then like a little bit later I was like, whoa, and then like when I saw Sue last night I was like, Sue, you just let it burn, like you just lit matches, and then you let it burn and then you walked away, like you would with the flames, like untended to in the background. So it was very, very interesting for me, and I think that definitely in terms of writing style and literary device is something I'm going to be thinking about a lot, because if you unpack every time a fire appears, you're saying a lot with those flames. All right, so we're going to pause the conversation on Angel's Demise here. We hope that you've had a little bit of a taste of what you can expect in the book. I promise you, this book is filled with all of your stories, your actual stories, not the way that your history has been told to you, but the way that your history actually probably has been lived through your families. All of the women are in this book, and they're having a great conversation through the events and journey that this book takes you through. So there's a lot that happens, and I, for one, am somebody who is like, what? Through many plot twists and turns throughout the book. So I'm so very grateful for this offering, And I'm so very grateful that you wrote this book. Thank you so much, Sue.
So thank you so much, Selina, for hosting me, and the conversation was awesome.
Okay, Sue, don't relax. We're not done. Okay, so most of you are probably Sue Nyathi fans. You have read her other 3 novels.